So what y'all just did was getting through this Cold War map, and y'all are realizing that the Cold War is just going to be a continuation of World War II. And what we're going to see is really at the end, during the war, it is what happens at Yalta that is going to shape the Cold War in that map y'all just did. Yalta is going to have the big three nations come together, the U.S., Great Britain, and the USSR, and they're going to agree what they're going to do to Germany because they want to make sure that they don't have another war. But the irony with war, when we try to have peace conferences, do they always lead to another war? And so it is what happens at Yalta that is going to shape the Cold War. We're going to see that they agreed to divide Germany up into 4 sectors. And the U.S., the British, the French, and the USSR will all get a sector, which you did on your map. What they're supposed to do is they're supposed to have free elections. But do you think free elections are going to happen? When we see this in the Cold War, free elections were supposed to happen in Germany, in Korea, in Vietnam. They will never happen. What happens is the USSR starts tearing out resources from East Germany. So do you think the U.S., the British, and the French want to unite with them? And so because of what they're doing, this is why free elections will never occur, and East and West Germany will form. The other thing y'all realized here is that the Soviet Union, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, they're going to create a sphere of influence. And y'all did that on your map, and it was colored red. The reason why they want a sphere of influence, it's just like in football. You have like a defensive line, right? And you want them to protect. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're protecting the Soviet Union from possible future invasion by the Germans. We're seeing that they're going to also create an international peacekeeping organization. We've seen this before from World War I. It was called the League, but did the League work out? No, so they're replacing it with the UN, and the UN is a little bit different than the League because it will have a military force, so it at least has some teeth. All of this stuff together from Yalta is really what's going to lead to our world being divided. And y'all had to do this on your map, that Winston Churchill is going to see that there is a clear division in the world, right? Y'all had red and blue, right? And y'all drew a line down Europe. And what he does is he realizes this divide, and he's going to call it the Iron Curtain. He does not give this speech in England. He's no longer prime minister, but he comes to the United States and does this speech at a university in Missouri. Why do you think he comes to the U.S.? What does the U.S. have that he wants them to step up their game? What does the U.S. have that we just used in World War II? The atomic bomb. And after World War I, the U.S. had become isolationist. And he fears if the U.S. becomes isolationist, eventually someone else could get the atomic bomb and dominate the world. So he's coming to Fulton, Missouri to basically ask the United States not to become isolationists. He's saying, look at what has happened in Europe. We see this Iron Curtain dividing us. And he's warning of Soviet expansionism if that the U.S. does not step up and try to threaten the Soviet Union with what? The bomb. They could expand and take over all of Europe. And so this is what you drew. We see that Iron Curtain is this little line that you drew in Europe, but he's warning. And this is when the U.S. will come up with a policy of containment. We are going to contain communism where it is, and this is going to bring the U.S. into several different affairs, such as the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Right. So these are our leaders that were at Yalta. Do y'all know who this guy is right here? This is Winston Churchill. Do y'all know who this guy is? Roosevelt. Do y'all know who this guy is? Stalin. But at the end of World War II, FDR will die of a brain hemorrhage. He's sitting down for his presidential portrait in Warm Springs, Georgia. Brain hemorrhage, dies. He's not going to be reelected. So the only one still left in the Cold War is who? Stalin. He's stalling around. Okay. So we're going to see they're going to clash. It is these allies that are clashing over something from the war. What two nations united to create the atomic bomb? From here, was it the U.S., Russia, or the British? What two nations? U.S. and the British. And so Stalin is going to be left out. And it's being left out that he finds through espionage that they had developed this. And so the USSR is actually going to turn against the US, first for being shut out of the atomic bomb. Second, they were slow to open up the Western Front. We see that they do the North Africa Front versus the D-Day Front of what they wanted in France. What we see by the end of the war, the Russians suffered 20 million casualties to the 1 million US casualties. Okay? And so they faced the grunt of the war. Also, at the end of the war, the US refuses to give any more aid to them. But do they need aid to rebuild their country? So this is why they tear out of stuff out of East Germany. We're also going to see that we terminated, that's what I was going over. So the Soviets realized that the US is not seeing eye to eye with them. They are not helping them. And so this is what's going to lead to them creating their own security organization, which is called what? Y'all just did it on your map. Warsaw. So the United Nations, they're going to have another clash. We're going to see this clash actually happens in the United States, where the UN is created in San Francisco. And a lot of it occurs with the Security Council. The Security Council is going to have the main nations. It's going to have the US, USSR, China. I'm not talking about mainland China, because y'all know mainland China falls to Mao Zedong. And it's going to be communist. And the US is not going to acknowledge China up until 1973. So we actually acknowledged, y'all know a little island called Taiwan? That's what we say is the real China, because that's the one where Chiang Kai-shek goes to. And so we're going to acknowledge nationalistic China with Chiang Kai-shek, which is in Taiwan, Britain, and France. But looking at this, there's one nation that is the odd man out that does not have the same belief systems here. Who doesn't have the same belief systems? US, USSR, China, Britain, or France. Who doesn't have the same belief systems? The USSR, right? They're the ones that's the odd man out. And this is what's going to lead to clash, because when they're going to agree to go to war to contain communism, the USSR will not agree, and they will often not show up. Okay, so dealing with the end of the war in Germany, one of the things that was agreed in the Yalta Agreement was the Nuremberg trials. And what they were doing at the Nuremberg trials is they were taking anybody who dealt with the concentration camps, the extermination camps, or who was ever in political office with the German Reich. They were going to go into these hearings. And Hitler knew of this, so that he was like, either I'm going to go to the Nuremberg trials and be executed, or I could kill myself beforehand. And so, like, he committed suicide. But have y'all heard of a series of Finding Hitler? There's a lot of series that say that he left and he actually went to Latin America. And there's like these detectives that are like trailing him and finding all his artifacts of how he wound up in Latin America. But for what we know in history is that he's going to commit suicide. Anybody who was involved with the Third Reich actually went to trial, and they will be executed for their crimes. Okay, so the big question really comes down to Germany. Germany is going to be the staging ground for the Cold War. We're going to see the Soviets did not want to ever see Germany rise up, because we've seen it rise up during World War I, World War II, and so what they're going to do is remove their resources. And if you were living in a country where all the industrial factories were being torn down and dismantled, what would that tell you about your economic livelihood? Is it going to be good, or is it going to be bad? Bad. And so people start fleeing out of East Germany. Is that good for communism when people are fleeing your country? And so this is what the USSR is facing. They're stripping those resources. People are fleeing, and they realize that they're having a huge migration problem. And it's not good for propaganda for communism. And so what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to plug the hole that is allowing people to flee. And really what's plugging the hole deals with Berlin. We know Germany's divided into four, but Berlin is also divided into four. There's a US, there's a French, and there's a Soviet sector, and there's a British sector. And most of the people are fleeing to the US, British, and French sector to flee out of Berlin. Okay, so here's Berlin, even further divided up. And so we're eventually going to get to the Berlin airlift, because they're going to block Berlin. One of the things the U.S. does at this time is people have realized the mass destruction of what we've done to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We're going to go in and reorganize a democratic government there. Also, we're going to have war crimes taken So y'all saw at one of the videos that I had showed y'all that a lot of the soldiers committed seppuku, they killed themselves, right? Because it was dishonorable to surrender. But anybody who was left over that was part of the military will be executed, except their emperor. We let them keep Hirohito. After this, the U.S. goes in, we deal with their war criminals, and then we create a new government there. And we encourage American businesses to go to Japan to revitalize their industry, because what have we done to their main two industrial sectors? Obliterated. So a lot of U.S. businessmen go into these companies that were previously there, such as Mitsubishi, and we start building. Have you heard of Mitsubishi before? Mm-hmm. It's a car company. We go in, Toyota, okay, and we rebuild. And eventually this is gonna bite us in our butt later, because in the 70s, we're not gonna have much oil, and our cars in America are gonna get 10 miles per gallon. And all of a sudden, these cars, what are they getting? More. They're getting 30 to 40 miles per gallon. And in the 1970s, who is America gonna buy cars from? The US or Japan? Japan. And it's because we revitalized their economy that they'll become a huge semiconductor industry. Okay. So our next policy, when dealing with what is going on in the Cold War, many of the nations who are part of the UN, who are a part of NATO, are going to adopt this policy of containment. And it stems from a U.S. ambassador, George Kennan, and he is in the Soviet Union. And he's looking at the propaganda that Stalin is saying, that Lenin has said, that they want world domination. And he's saying that the U.S., along with the UN, and along with NATO, need to step up and stem communism, contain it where it is. And so President Truman will take on this policy of containment. And this policy of containment will bring us into issue with Turkey and Greece. Because if you look at Turkey and Greece, they're actually on the other side of the Iron Curtain, but they're democratic countries. Britain has come out of this area, so they're very fearful that the Soviet Union could take it over. And the U.S. is looking at Turkey and Greece as strategically important, that we could put some missiles here in the future that we develop. And if we put missiles here, it will take us about 5 minutes to get to St. Petersburg and Moscow. So are we worried about them falling to communism? But it's also kind of selfish, because we want to put missiles there, and this will eventually lead us to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the U.S. also realizes that West Germany and also Western Europe could fall to communism. And the only way to prevent that is kind of bankrolling Western Europe with money so they don't turn to it. So the Marshall Plan will be created that at least gives $13 billion to revitalize Western Europe. And most of Eastern Europe is not allowed to accept the money because they're part of the Warsaw Pact. The other thing that is created in the United States is the National Security Act. Many of you probably know of the CIA. The CIA will be created out of this act so we could go get foreign information on what is going on, the subversive activities in the world. We're also going to see, have you ever heard of the Pentagon before? Mm-hmm. Not the shape, but the building, right? Hopefully you've heard of the shape, okay? But the Pentagon's created from the National Security Council. And all of this money goes into the building of it, that instead of having a Secretary of War in the United States, we have a Department of Defense. So have you heard of that? Where all the branches of the military come in. We also have an Atomic Energy Commission that comes in that will give advice to the president in the time of the Cold War of policies he should do. And so again, National Security Council will get us involved in China, it will get us involved in Korea, it will get us involved in Vietnam. Right, so our main issue goes back to Germany, where we're talking about Berlin being a problem because people could flee out of West Berlin. And we're seeing that the Soviets do not like West Berlin here because it's basically their hole of where people are exiting out of their nation. So they want to plug that hole. So what they do is they basically do a blockade. They don't let any rail lines or cars or trucks into West Berlin that would provide food. So the United States says at this time, if we cannot get in by the road and by land, we will do it by air. And so for over almost about a year, food is flown into people of West Berlin. So that's what he was trying to do. Stalin was trying to starve them out. But by this whole airlift, we will see that West Berlin will still remain part of the US, British, and French sector. And this will eventually lead down the road that Stalin realizes, and then his next predecessor, Khrushchev, that they need to build what around Berlin? A wall. And it's because of the failed attempt here that the wall will eventually be built by Nikita Khrushchev. And have you ever seen the movie Cloudy with the Chance of Meatballs? A lot of that idea from that movie came from what happened here, because they will interview kids, because like they were really young, these kids. They're going to start interviewing them and asking them, where do you think food comes from? And for a whole year, food was just raining down from the sky. And oftentimes they're sending other things that are enticing, such as Christmas gifts. They're sending candy and these things. And so a lot of kids have these tell stories of where food came from the air. So it's always an interesting story. So again, the U.S. just sent tons of aid. Do y'all see how they have little parachutes? They would even parachute glass bottles of milk down. So like we're talking about every single thing these people needed was coming down by parachute. Okay, so again, y'all did this map, right? We see that the Iron Curtain is becoming more prevalent. Right, so I had talked about China, and we had two leaders. We have Mao Zedong, who was leading the communists. It's a little bit different than what we saw with Russian communism. Russian communism was about industrialization. Chinese communism is more about agrarian agriculture and parsing out the land. We're going to see the other guy, Chiang Kai-shek, right, or JJ for short. He's actually wanting to be more united with the United States, and they have a civil war at the end of World War II, and we're going to see Mao Zedong really wins. And this is what's going to lead to the fall of China under communism. And we will see Mao proclaims the Republic of China, and this is what leads to Mao and Stalin having a unity pact between those two nations. Eventually it will fall apart. Right? And at this time, we don't recognize mainland China as the real China. We recognize Taiwan. The real first skirmish of the Cold War deals with Korea. You have to understand the end of World War II. Remember, Japan, prior to World War II, had obtained all the land in the Pacific. And so when they surrender after the atomic bombs, the U.S. still has to go and fight in China to liberate it, in Indochina and liberate it, and in Korea. And so the USSR is coming into the war August 8th. And what's going to happen is the U.S. and the Soviet Union are going to agree to conquer Korea jointly. The Soviet Union will come in through the north. The U.S. will come in through the south, and they'll stop at the 38th parallel. And eventually, in 2 years, after they set up stable governments there, they would have free elections. What do we think about free elections? Is it going to occur? And so what will happen is North Korea will become the aggressor nation, which is kind of prevalent today, right? We see North Korea always trying to push around South Korea today. And North Korea will invade South Korea. And it's at this time that the UN realizes, do we need to go in and help South Korea? The UN will send in the UN forces under the direction of Dwight D. Eisenhower, and they will basically push North Korea back. And this will lead China to coming into the situation and the Soviet Union coming into the situation. So it basically will lead to a stalemate. And at the end of this war, they're going to agree by 1953 to keep Korea divided. And this is how Korea is today, right? Do we still see North Korea being the aggressor? There was only one time they united, and that was in the 2008 soccer games for FIFA. Okay, I basically went through the whole war. Okay, and then Korea is still divided today. Okay, but this brings up the idea that did the U.S. want to contain communism? And we're going to try to keep everything to the status quo, and this is just going through the movements of it, which you'll never be tested. So the results, 3 million are dead, and basically the war went back to exactly what it was. So 3 million people died for the exact same results. Okay. This is what's really going to get us involved in Indochina. It's the idea of the domino theory. That if one nation fell to communism, what's going to happen to the others? And so in Vietnam, we're facing an issue. In Vietnam, it is also had been taken over by the Japanese. And the French are trying to come in. And we have a guy leading a movement named Ho Chi Minh, who wants all of Vietnam to be united under him, under a nationalist communist type of credo. And if they fall, we're very fearful that the rest of Indochina will fall, and then the Pacific will fall, and we're going to see in Latin America communist nations will rise up, such as in Cuba, and we're going to see this in Nicaragua. So the U.S. is going to be very fearful, and many of the UN nations will be very fearful that communism could take root. And we're going to stop there. Because